awful lot to rhythm and blues music. Everything that I've done has had that as a basis. First artist I really sort of dug was Little Richard when I was about 8 years old. I found it very exciting. And it made me sort of really get interested in black music, American black music. And for a number of years I worked with rhythm and blues bands. So for me, I think, one of the foundations of my interest and in also my participation in music has been my own black ties.
Black Tie, White Noise is the title of David Bowie's first solo album in 6 years. The soul and spirit of rhythm and blues is the foundation for Bowie's latest musical adventure, exploring challenging themes and ideas with style and substance. It's a project he's handled with care, along with Nile Rodgers, who, with Bowie, produced the successful album Let's Dance.
I think what it was that we both latched onto when we were talking is that there was something happening yet again to both dance music and popular music. There was a certain kind of formula creeping back into everything. And it's at those points you really want to try and break things open again. And we had this idea that there were certain elements of dance and R&B that we really liked. We had some ideas of throwing experimental stuff into that format.
I know when David and I talk, half of the time we get in these elaborate discussions about just different musical cultures and different sources of the music, different origins of the music before we even do anything. And because of his broad musical background and the type and the taste that he has, I know that it's going to be very, very exciting for me as a musician, but at the same time that there is a point of view. I mean, we are going someplace.
If left to my own devices, I will really go off at a tangent. And Niall can bring things back in a very sort of, in a form that people will sort of assimilate easily.
But also, you got to remember to not compromise the artistic integrity.
I really get kind of indulgent, and Niall is very good at making it more accessible.
There's definitely never a dull moment. I know that he's always going to surprise me. When David comes in with a song, no matter how simple the motif, I know that in his head somewhere, there's a myriad of unbelievable ideas.
I think Black Tie, White Noise, it refers to the racial boundaries that have been put up in most of the Western world. White noise itself is something that I first encountered on a synthesizer many years ago. There's black noise and white noise. And I thought so much of what is said and done by the whites is white noise, so I thought I'd latch onto that. Black Ties is because, for me, musically, the one thing that really turned me on to wanting to be a musician and wanting to write was black music. Jazz and rock artists of the 50s. It also has a lot to do with the black and white side of one's thinking, the inside voice and the outside voice, the voice that the world hears and the voice that you speak to yourself with. It's all those issues.
The music on the album includes Bowie's own work on the saxophone, as well as the work of a number of talented musicians who contributed a diverse selection of musical styles.
Let's do the thing.
From Trinidad came guitarist Wild T.
It's sort of like a lilting take on Hendrix style guitar, and he was an absolute delight. I mean, I've never worked with him before. He came straight from a show, I think. I think he flew straight in from a show in Vancouver. And he's very, very tired when he got here, but he worked really hard.
Everything changes once the music starts.
Jazz great Lester Bowie added some of his subtle trumpet work.
It was his surname that made me go out and buy his CDs, and what a pleasant surprise. I mean, he's got to be one of the major inheritors of the Miles Davis approach to playing. You have to follow him around the studio with a microphone because he won't stand still. He's absolutely wonderful. I couldn't resist it. Lester, the Bowie brothers. It had to be.
The album also reunited David with his Spiders from Mars guitarist, Mick Ronson.
Where they're bringing you in is the solo, and then right where you're coming in. It's the first real time that we've worked together in almost 20 years. We sort of kept track of each other through the years, though. Every time I go on tour, Mick turns up somewhere along the line and comes and guests on the show. And I asked him if he would come for old time's sake and work on a song that we both liked very much, which was The Cream's I Feel Free. And he said he'd be delighted to do that. And he came along and played his usual breathtaking solos. I mean, what you require from the solo player, unless you're a complete control freak, is you want somebody to interpret what they're hearing in their own way, and that gives the song a character of its own, and that's where it really becomes a collaboration. And that's what each of these individuals did.
Vocally participating with David on the album was singer Al B. Sure, who joined in on the record's title track.
He is one of the most generous, giving artists. I mean, I had a particular thing that I wanted to do with this song, and he spent such a long time, and he's really dedicated at doing what he does. He understands very much what I was trying to do. I don't think I've ever seen anybody work harder. He's really great.
These collaborations, nurtured by Bowie and Rogers, form the backbone of Black Tie, White Noise. The synthesis of these various musical textures can be heard in the album's first single, Jump, They Say.
One of the major differences in the way that we're working this time, possibly because we're older, is that I think the sessions and the things that we do talk about are a lot more informed by our personal lives this time around than they were the last time around. In the early 80s, I think we were more sort of hip to that sounds were very much almost the entire substance of our life and the music itself. I think in the 10 years subsequently, one's sort of grown and matured a bit more, and one's personal life starts to mean a lot more to oneself. And I think those things come up, and that starts being reflected in the music. It certainly has an impact on the music.
The shaking man, a nation in his eyes, striped with blood and emblazed tattoo, streaking cathedral style. They say, he has no brain. They say, he has no mood. They say, he was born again, they say. Look at him climb, they say. Jump. They say, jump.
I haven't worked with Nile since about 1983 on the Let's Dance album. And in those days, I think the difference with working with Nile then and working with Nile now is that I would leave him to do far more of the arrangements on that particular album, on Let's Dance. And we met again to make this album at a club after a couple of the Tin Machine performances in New York. He came along to the shows. And we got talking afterwards and talked about what we liked in music, what we didn't like in music, and all that. And a lot of our ideas seemed very similar. So we really made a kind of a commitment that if I was going to do another solo album, that I'd work with him on it, because so many of our musical ideas were parallel. And then when I did eventually start writing the album, I called him up and asked if he wanted to go in with me still, and he said yeah. And what I found was the major change with working with Niall this time around is that probably I'm contributing a lot more to how I wanted the songs to work, to a much greater degree than the last time we worked together. He doesn't use the telephone as much, and he was there on the mixes. The selection of musicians was, I guess, instigated by Niall. He suggested some people that he'd been working with that he liked a lot. One of them being Barry Campbell on bass. Barry's a young guy, about 22, 23 years old, and he's only been working in the clubs in New York. He'd never really done any studio work before. So for him, I think it was pretty exciting to get involved in a kind of a real bunch of sessions with new music. The drummer I knew from several years ago, Sterling Campbell, no relation to Barry, because Sterling was the drummer with Duran Duran for a while. And he's a really a rock-solid, really dependable kind of typical New York sound drummer. Very good. On keyboards we had Philip Sazy, who's a Frenchman, expatriate now living in New York. And on each of the songs I generally tried to get a different instrumentalist to take the solo, except for one, and that was Lester Bowie. Lester Bowie, I met Joe Bowie, his brother, in London a number of years ago, and Joe told me then to listen to Lester's work because he thought he was just terrific. And I did. And Lester indeed is I think one of the greatest trumpet players around at the moment. He's much occupies the space that Miles Davis had up until he died. And Lester came in primarily to do one track with us, but the working on that track was so exciting that we let him take over about 5 or 6 tracks. And so he's really become the alternative sound to the saxophone that I'm playing on the album. The other musicians are Mike Garson, who comes from the latter days of the Spiders. And I hadn't seen Mike Garson in years, and out of the blue I got a phone call from him, pertinently just around the time of making this album. So I asked him if he's going to be in New York to come and play. And he played on one of the instrumentals, piano. And Mick Ronson, of course. Mick Ronson I brought in to the Queen concert last year with Ian Hunter of Mott the Hoople, and we did a version of All the Young Dudes. And at that particular time I said that I told Mick that I would really love to work with him in the studio again. I've worked with him off and on over the years, because every time we've done a tour, since 1974, he's usually turned up at some of the gigs and jammed with us on stage. But we haven't done any studio work before. And the decision to make I Feel Free the cut that we work on is because in the very early Spider days, that was one of our encore numbers, that Cream number. And it was kind of nice to complete the circle and do a new updated version of that particular song. There's Reeves Gabrels. He appears on a track called You've Been Around. That was originally written musically for Tin Machine, but they didn't want to do the thing. They said they didn't like it, so we kept it back, and I've used it on this album, and I've rewritten lyrics that kind of are more appropriate for this album. And I got Reeves to play on it. I used him playing several guitar solos, and at the end I intercut them so that there's a kind of fragmented, scrambly kind of sound to his playing. And I put him right in the background. And he hasn't heard it yet, and he'll complain because he's not loud enough. But I shall send him a copy anyway. And the last person, I think, is Wild T. Wild T, interestingly enough, is a Trinidadian guitar player who plays much in the style of Hendrix. But he lives in Canada. He's he's one of the leading blues guitarists in Canada. He's got a lilting approach to Hendrix. It's kind of a very melodic Caribbean-flavoured Hendrix. And Wild T, I heard his stuff again whilst I was touring with Tin Machine. And he came to a show there, and I said, I'd love you to work with me at some point. I don't think he really ever expected a phone call. But I phoned him up a few days before the sessions, and he flew down from the gig to work on the track. I think that's all. It's quite noticeable that there's a hip-hop house kind of flavour to a lot of the tracks. Although it's not sort of really in your face, it's not shoved down your throat. I wanted to work against that texture, and it was something that Niall is particularly enthusiastic about, because Niall tends to be a club person, a night person, where I'm not. I mean, I kind of quit the studio around 7 in the evening, which is just about the time Niall gets in. But he tends to go out after the studio and disappear into the wee hours and go all over New York from club to club. I find dance music fascinating anyway, I always have done. And Niall really brought in that kind of flavour to the track. As I say, it's not really a forceful version of dance music. It's more, it's almost like a background relief. It's kind of like you're hearing the city from a few miles away, but you're seeing it through kind of fog or mist. It seems to me that dance music, and rap music particularly, seem to reflect a lot of the degrees of chaos that run through society at the moment. I think that's probably why they made such a pertinent mark with a lot of people, is that they recognise the fragmentation, because it exists in their everyday life. There's a feeling of, often a feeling of no hope about today's situation, a feeling of chaos and never-ending strife, and I think that's reflected fairly accurately through that particular kind of music. I think maybe to put a more positive thing on it, I think that it's working towards becoming a new kind of music, and I think it'll become even more articulate as the years go by. What we've tried to do with our variation on it is imbue it with some sense of a European melody line. There's a very strong European flavour to what we've done, even though it's fundamentally an American foundation. It's not the first time that I've worked in that way. In fact, I think probably a lot of the music that I'm best known for is reflected that way of working, that I've taken a fundamentally American foundation or bedrock of rhythm, and over the top of it layered different textures, usually very European in feel. I think it probably goes back to initially a track called 1984 on the Diamond Dogs album, which was sort of playing around in the backyard of Shaft. But it had a melody line on it which could quite easily have been taken from an English musical. When Iman and myself arrived back from Italy after a holiday in LA, I think the one thing, I think it was almost inevitable that having arrived back on the day that the riots started and being there throughout the duration of them, and all the ensuing chaos and this almost Beirut-type situation with pillars of black smoke everywhere and a feeling of helplessness almost. It was both numbing and exhilarating at the same time. It left a deep impression on me. And it really was a situation that I wanted to address and something I wanted to comment on and write about. Once I'd finished the lyric, I was rather at a loss as to how to do it, because I wanted to do it with somebody. It was written for two voices. And a friend of mine was also a friend of Albie Shaw, and he suggested that he get in touch with Albie. Albie came to the studio and hung out with us for about 4 or 5 days, and I gave him a copy of the lyrics to the song, and he took them home and read them over, and he phoned up a day or so later and said he would love to do the song with me. So I was very flattered because he's a fine singer. I was a little worried because our voices are very different, but to me, I think there's a real empathy between them. For me, it's one of my favourite songs on the album. There seems to be a nostalgic kind of thing going on for the 70s at the moment, especially in England. I'm not sure where that comes from. I mean, I hope it's not just because of our silly clothes that we used to wear. And if I have to join it, I refuse to wear the Stackyard boots. Or shave my eyebrows. Or dye my hair red. I don't know where it comes from. One feels as though it's sort of maybe... Those were really extraordinarily experimental times. I think everybody had a real sense of adventure and were grabbing onto every kind of freedom that they could. I mean, it was the tail end of the 60s. There was still that spirit of you can try anything, and that will be, you know, a real way of making life exciting. And I think a lot of those opportunities are not present for the present younger generation. I think they feel almost trapped inside a kind of almost a really repressive and ominous kind of social fabric, and I feel they're kind of reflecting this nostalgia thing for what the 70s seems to be for them. It's a spirit of freedom and adventure. Out of it has come some very kind of interesting music. I think one of the major bands in Britain at the moment, I think potentially one of the biggest bands in Britain, called Suede. I like their songwriting very much indeed, and I like the guitar player tremendously, Bernard. I think his name is. And I would hope that once the 70s trappings have fallen away from that band, and that they're allowed to be just a band and not a 70s revival band or whatever, or 70s influence band, I would imagine that they'll stay around for a very long time because they have great songwriting ability. I think that's the only band that I'd sort of put my money on for the moment. Many of the grunge bands, kind of, to me, they smack a lot of the Johnny-come-lately approach to what was happening in the 80s, especially the mid-80s, with bands like the Pixies and Sonic Youth, and it's sort of almost 7, 8 years later now, and these other bands come tumbling out of the wardrobe, like, I was going to call it Spinal or something, Nirvana, and their brothers in arms. And I'm not a big fan of those bands, because I kind of feel as though it's like almost a comfortable, safe version of what bands like Sonic Youth were doing in the middle 80s. I was also very disappointed that the Pixies split up, because I think they were one of my favourite bands of the late 80s. On this record, I can safely say that I think just about every track on it is one that I really am glad that I put it on the CD. I like them all very much indeed. But among my favourites on it is one called You've Been Around. Another one will be Black Tie, White Noise. And indeed the first single from that album, Jump, I think. We've done a video for the single. I couldn't really visualize. I had a lot of problems visualizing what to do with it. So I turned it over, really, lock, stock and barrel, to a young American director called Mark Romanek. He's of the school of Stanley Kubrick, so it's a long, letterbox, clear, terrifically graphic eye, and realism in it is almost super real because of his lighting and the clarity of detail. It's an extraordinary piece of work with a mid-60s Euro steel and glass tech kind of look to it. And I think his point is that he's trying to show how man finds himself, when confronted with the anonymity of this kind of high-tech environment, finds himself confused and pretty depressed. As much as I'd really like to perform these songs live in solo performance, I'm not planning on touring this year. I think I would probably be hopefully touring as a solo artist towards the end of next year. The main reason for that is that I've only just recently gotten married, and the one thing I don't want to do is to disappear on tour for the next year. It's a very, very bad thing to do. As regards how my songwriting has changed or not changed over the years, an interesting thing happened the other day. I read an article in one of the musical papers over in England. The magazine's called the NME. And they republished an interview with me from 1973, a 3-page interview, verbatim, exactly as it was. And I seem to be describing my songwriting methods in exactly the same way as I write now, that I was talking about how I was cutting up different points of view and different opinions and put them against each other. In fact, what I was talking about was the same juxtaposition that I still use in songwriting to this very day. So I think basically, overall, my songwriting style hasn't really changed. I may have added to it and involved new, different processes and different ways of working, but fundamentally it's still the same as it ever was.